We left off last time with some nice, simple patrolling for our enemy, but we can't just have them walking around forever, so we need to start piling more thoughts into that empty little head of his. Today we're going to be adding some actual stealth behaviour to our system, and just that little bit more complexity. Let's get started. Enemies aren't going to be much of a threat if they don't have any senses. Right now they can walk around, and even then Unity's pathfinding is doing most of that work. We need a way of letting the enemy understand its surroundings, and for that we need a couple new methods. For anything that the enemy can interact with, we want to attach a little script to it. Just like our point modifier script from last time, this script runs no actual code, and only contains accessible information about the object that it's attached to. So, if we bring our player back and attach this script to him somewhere, he can now be given a type that the enemy can work with. We'll also have another script that'll collect any object with this script attached. I want to keep this pool updated, but I also don't want it to be running all the time. This script will pull everything it needs at the start, and then this method can be called again when I need to update the objects in the pool. Now that we have a collection of objects that the enemy can interact with, and have given them types to help the enemy choose between them, we can begin constructing some new AI. This is the Watcher method. It takes information from that pool and keeps track of the objects within it. So, let's say we're sneaking around. The enemy might not be able to see us right now. We aren't physically in the field of view, but the Watcher knows exactly where we are. Because we have that little script that defines us as the player, and because we have been collected into a pool of other objects with little scripts attached to them, the Watcher will know whatever it needs to know. The information that is important for the enemy to know for now is our distance and our angle from themselves. These two numbers will determine if we are within a particular range of the enemy. If we're under a certain distance value or under a particular angle, then we are assumed to be in the enemy's field of view, otherwise the enemy won't be able to see us. For some targets of the Watcher, this is actually enough logic to work with, but not for the player. The line of sight must be established, and if we only used these two numbers to let the enemy know when the player is nearby, then the enemy would be able to see us through walls, which usually constitutes bad game design. The line of sight must be established. When the player is in the correct range, another check kicks in. From the enemy's head, I draw lines to various parts of the player's body. Right now, this consists of the head, the body, and the knees. I point them at the knees because pointing them directly at the feet causes issues. The enemy will know whether these lines connect with their targets, or if they get interrupted by something in between. The logic gets a little twisted here, so I'll keep it simple. If all four lines connect, and the player is close enough, the player is basically in full view of the enemy. If 2 or 3 of the 4 lines connect, the player can mostly be seen but has been slightly obscured. If only 1 line connects, then the player is fully obscured by an obstacle. If no lines connect, then the player is of course hidden. The number of lines that make it all the way to the player is of importance here. If at least 1 can connect, then the enemy has a line of sight to the player and a timer has started. The speed of this timer depends on the number of lines that are able to connect. The better the line of sight, the better an enemy will be able to identify and catch the player. Once any of these lines connect and we are in range, the enemy will turn to face the player. This signals to us that the enemy has become suspicious. A timer has been started and the enemy has line of sight. If we don't break it soon, the enemy will act on his suspicion and go to investigate this dumbass standing behind a wall. If we can break it before the timer goes too high, the enemy will return to his regular patrol. Of course, we also need to simulate the enemy's ears as well. Rather than writing a new method for listening to stuff, we can just fudge it easily as good. If the player gets too close and starts doing dumb shit like running around or something else to catch the enemy's attention, lo and behold, they'll get it. By checking if the player is in a certain state, we can call for the enemy to turn around and take notice. Because the player is far too close for the enemy to just be suspicious, we'll trigger the chase method and let them sort it out from there. More on that later. The new method we have here is the investigation method. This simply takes the player's last known position and sets it as the enemy's destination. We'll be fiddling around with that method later on though. If the enemy manages to bridge more of those lines of sight, the timer will tick up faster and eventually hit a maximum threshold. Now, we've been in the crosshairs of the enemy for far too long, and the enemy, with the help of the Watcher, has found us, launching us into a new state. Because the Watcher is dealing with an interaction between the player and the enemy, arguably the most important interaction, this is probably as complicated as the logic will get. There are of course other things that the Watcher can identify that will trigger some more behaviours in the enemy's AI. If an enemy can see its friends and they get close enough, I can trigger a new behaviour and let them talk to each other. But bringing in more enemies will be something for next time, so we'll get rid of this guy for now. If our player is a bad boy and actually manages to kill something, the still alive enemy is going to have to do something about that dead body. Our investigation method can now be expanded to fit in a new behaviour, one that I will be lifting almost directly from Metal Gear Solid. It's all well and good getting the enemy to go to the player's last known position and have a wee skelly, but getting him to sweep the area for threats is a far more complex process. Combining these two behaviours into one method is going to be tricky, but it can be done. When this method is triggered, the enemy will open with one of their idle animations. I wanted something else, but my animations are just as limited as they were last time, so this'll have to do for now. Because the method controlling these animations will return true when they finish, the second part of the method can kick in. The enemy will go and check the player's last known position. If they don't find anything, they'll play another animation and return to a normal patrol. This is only in the case that the player was the one who triggered this method. In the case that this method is triggered by the enemy finding a dead body or something that is highly suspicious, the investigation will continue. The enemy will sample a random position from around them, making sure that said position is on the nav mesh so that it can actually be moved to. The enemy will now move to that position and perform another animation. Once the animation ends, a new position is chosen and the cycle repeats. By having another timer, we can tell the enemy to stop the investigation loop after a certain amount of time. The Watcher is still capable of identifying other objects, of course, but these are things that the player will be involved with. I like the idea of the player being able to manipulate the environment in their favour, and the premise here is that too much manipulation of the arena's objects will make enemies increasingly suspicious. The Watcher will keep track of which objects have been messed with and which ones have been left alone, adding to the enemy's suspicion if the player doesn't stealth conservatively. We'll explore this idea in the future. In the event that the player gets caught by an enemy, then any current behaviours will cease immediately and a chase will commence. A chase between a single enemy and the player isn't really that complicated, and the Watcher is still keeping things in check for us. The enemy is given a new destination, which just so happens to be the player. The enemy's speed will be increased, and they'll begin running towards us. The idea here is of course to escape and break that line of sight. The Watcher is still going, and the lines are still being drawn. All we need to do is check again for how many lines are connected. If we, as the player, can keep those lines severed for long enough, then we've lost the enemy, and the chase can end. Things will of course get more complicated when more enemies get thrown into the mix, but that will all come next time. The last little bit of AI I wanted to add is an additional post-chase behaviour. After a chase, the enemy will know that the player is there, and will change their patrols accordingly. They will wait around at choke points more often, and become more likely to take branching paths. If they get close to the player's hiding spot, they'll have a random chance to go and investigate that position. This will make the post-chase cooldown period much more difficult and incentivize clever stealthing from the player and force them to keep moving around to avoid being caught again. Barring the behaviours that involve multiple enemies, that concludes our additional enemy behaviours. Our enemy can now see and hear us and understand different parts of the arena around it, which we'll see more of in the future. Of course, a stealth system is a bit crap with only one enemy kicking around. So next time, our little coding adventure will continue as we give our player a whole load of new friends to play hide and seek with. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you next time.